In April 2019, Rugby Australia found themselves in the middle of a communication crisis. Today, we're going to do a critical analysis on that crisis. It is involving the Israel Folau social media post and his subsequent termination of the contract. In April, one of its best contracted players, Israel Folau, had posted a religious message, one which could be seen as both controversial and inflammatory on Instagram. This placed Rugby Australia in a position where a decision had to be made, one that could be divisive either way, and such had to be managed expertly from a communication perspective. The actions taken by Rugby Australia did in fact split public opinion, specifically whether it is okay or allowed to post religious messages even if they are discriminatory. And such, it is important to examine the timeline of events, critically analysing the crisis communication framework in play, while also suggesting some alternative approaches which may have led to a more positive result. Today, we're going to follow the proposed agenda. We are first going to examine the time pre the April 2019 post, focusing on the relationship between Folau and Rugby Australia, and specifically were there any tactics or strategies that Rugby Australia could have used to limit the size of this impending crisis. This will directly draw on the PPRR risk management framework, specifically the prevention element. We will then transition into April 2019 when Folau uploaded the post. It is in this time that most critical analysis of Rugby Australia's response and crisis communication approach can occur, specifically within the first 24 hours, which relates directly to Tony Jark's response framework. Rugby Australia wisely chose to organise an independent hearing in this case before terminating Folau's contract, and this will be examined in detail, leading into the subsequent legal action from Folau and the now infamous GodFundMe site. We will then conclude with a look into the future for this crisis, proposing some methods which Rugby Australia can use to limit the negative impact of this instance and also any recurring instances going forward. So, pre-post. Israel Folau had been contracted to Rugby Australia since 2013, proving to not only be one of its most talented, but also most marketable athletes. With Rugby Australia and Folau seemingly working together seamlessly to promote the game of rugby in Australia. Folau has played over 60 tests, scoring 32 tries, and has won the John Eales Medal, awarded to the Best Player of the Year, multiple times. His talent, combined with his religious and family views, ensured he appealed to a variety of rugby supporters and sponsors. For the first 4 years of playing rugby, he proved himself to be a valuable asset to the Rugby Australia organisation. However, in 2017, the first signs of disconnect appeared. This was when Folau tweeted, "I love and respect all people for who they are and their opinions, but personally, I will not support gay marriage." This was in contrast to Rugby Australia, who earlier had thrown their public support behind same-sex marriage. This disconnect continued a year later when Folau, in responding to a question on his Instagram asking what would happen to homosexual people, he claimed they would go to hell unless they repent of their sins and turn to God. This was the first clear sign that Rugby Australia could potentially have a crisis on their hands, and it also afforded them the opportunity to get ahead of it and mitigate any further trouble. In this case, Rugby Australia chose to warn Folau that his response was in breach of its inclusion policy. However, no direct action was taken. In fact, during this time, Folau's contract was up for renewal, and Rugby Australia decided to offer him a new 4-year multi-million-dollar contract. Critically, Rugby Australia did not insert any specific clauses around use of social media and adherence to the inclusion policy within this contract. Rugby Australia would have been well served to pay more importance to the prevention element of the PPRR framework, which would have outlined some steps to take to ensure a similar or worse instance does not occur again. Choosing not to use the compelling event of a renewing contract to prevent a crisis occurring again was a clear oversight of Rugby Australia and left them in a vulnerable position. True to form, exactly 12 months later, Folau posted an Instagram post paraphrasing the Bible, in which he warned that drunks, homosexuals, adulterers, liars, fornicators, thieves, atheists, idolaters, hell awaits you, repent, only Jesus saves. This was the thing Rugby Australia had feared, and they were immediately placed in a tough position where they had to respond quickly. They did this by calling in Folau to explain the post. Folau, however, was completely unresponsive and did not return any of Rugby Australia's calls. This resulted in Rugby Australia issuing a statement a day later that they had attempted to contact Folau over the past 24 hours with no success and intended to terminate his contract unless he could prove there were mitigating factors to this post. Folau was offered 48 hours to respond to the high-level code of conduct breach. This is in line with JARC's recommendations, specifically the need to respond quickly and admit what you don't know, as well as setting a time frame for when more information will be available. This was well done by Rugby Australia. They quite clearly said there are areas of this we do not know, but they offered a time frame for when they do want to know more, and the initial reaction to this from the public and Rugby Australia stakeholders was mostly positive. A short time later, with still no response from Folau, Rugby Australia CEO Raylene Castle chose to do a press conference explaining the situation. She said, "It was made clear to Israel in writing and verbally when I met with him last year that any social media posts or commentary that in any way were disrespectful to people because of their sexuality would result in disciplinary action. Despite this, Israel has chosen to ignore this warning." Again, this is a very well-released statement with accuracy and firmness. But Rugby Australia perhaps did not properly understand the potential reaction of their words. Rugby Australia would have done well to be more informed about the emotional response to the crisis or outrage as put forward by Peter Sandman, and it was here some of the public support for Rugby Australia began to swing. By incorporating Sandman's message to be aware of potential emotional reactions with a clear understanding of relevant stakeholders, Rugby Australia may have limited the level of reaction to their words. As Timothy Coombs argues, management must be able to see the event from the perspective of the stakeholders in order to properly assess whether a crisis has occurred. It is tough to say which specific words may have instigated such an inflammatory reaction, but perhaps limit it specifically to sexuality when there were a number of other elements present in Folau's post, ensure the spotlight was focused on this extremely divisive issue. As with any controversial issue, there will be people who are for and against, and by focusing only on sexuality, Rugby Australia may have isolated certain camps with this post, or with this response. Following this immediate response, Rugby Australia wisely chose to organise an hearing to look into the situation and to understand whether they were in the right frame to terminate Folau's contract. On this hearing was John West, QC, as chair, Rugby Australia representative Kate Eastman, and the Rugby Union Players Association appointed representative John Boultby. The idea of an independent hearing was a good one, but the inclusion of a Rugby Australia representative was perhaps the wrong call. Without personally having too much knowledge of the legal requirements of such a hearing, the mere perception of bias would be enough to further outrage some stakeholders. Following the 3-day hearing, the panel found Folau guilty of high-level breach, and such supported Rugby Australia's decision to formally terminate Folau's contract. They released the following statement, reiterating that rugby is a game for all, and people need to feel safe and welcomed. These words were strong. However, and may have been slightly assumptive and speculative, which Jarks had warned against. In response, Folau released a statement, reinforcing his belief in Christianity and his duty to upholding his religious beliefs. This is clear that the disconnect with Rugby Australia and Folau had grown to the stage where it may not be possible to reconcile. This paused a few days later when Folau released a statement that he intended to challenge the decision by taking Rugby Australia to court and suing them for wrongful termination to the tune of $10 million. Rugby Australia's response was understandable, as they immediately said it was a legal matter, and due to this they were restricted on talking on it too much further. Rugby Australia at this point was in a position where there was a clear divide among their stakeholders as to who was in the right. This divide widened shortly after when Folau set up a GoFundMe page for his legal costs. Referred to colloquially as GodFundMe, the move by Folau to use a platform that is normally occupied with families of ones who have passed or are gravely ill widened the divide amongst the Rugby Australia stakeholders. Some completely supported Folau's choice to raise money for his legal campaign, and that is typified by the $685,000 raised here, as you've seen, after only 2 days. Others were completely on Rugby Australia's side and saw this action as nothing more than penny pinching. While this act was by Folau and subsequently meant that it was not in Rugby Australia's control, it still played a large part in how Rugby Australia had been viewed in this crisis. Looking forward, there is no clear end in sight for this issue. Earlier this month it was in the courts, with a number of top legal minds saying it's likely to end up in the High Court. Rugby Australia will have to abide by the process of law, but there are a few things they can take on and learn which may improve their crisis communication method going forward. Apportioning more importance to the potential outrage of any statement, while also ensuring that there are actions taken to resolve disputes with stakeholders, should be key. Continuing to follow Jarks' framework for response will be important as they move into the final stage of the PPRR framework, recovery. As Ulmer has said, instead of focusing on strategically avoiding responsibility or blame, a discourse of renewal approach stems from an underlying, immediate and instinctive response based upon the positive values and virtues of a leader. Rugby Australia's leaders need to step up in this moment. That is both Raelene Castle, CEO, and other board members. They need to make sure that they are exhibiting positive values and virtues of a leader. If they do this, Rugby Australia will be able to effectively move on from this event and start to go back to business as usual, where the message is consistently one about rugby and not these divisive issues.